Hello, everyone. This is Mrs. G's Storytime, and we are reading Treasures of the Snow by Patricia Sangen with permission of Moody Publishing Company. And we are on Chapter 12, Annette's Revenge. Lucien did not go up the mountain with his cows, for the Morels only had 4 cows, which they farmed out with another herd for the summer. So until haymaking started in his field around his home, Lucien had plenty of time after school. He went to visit the old man on the mountain nearly every day. His horse was nearly finished, and it was a beautiful piece of work for a boy of Lucien's age. It was a larger model than he had ever tried before, with a flying mane and little hoofs that hardly seemed to touch the ground. Lucien spent hours over it and studied every horse in the neighborhood so that he might make each muscle look perfect. He still had plenty of time, because the competition was not going to be judged until the end of the haymaking holiday. But already the school children were beginning to make guesses about who would win. Most of the boys thought it would be Michael, the milkman's son, who had carved 2 bears climbing up a pole. He had worked hard, and it was a good piece of work. But they could have easily been mistaken for dogs or any other animals, thought Lucien, looking at them silently while the other children admired it loudly. Nobody could mistake his horse, thought Lucien. It was a horse and nothing but a horse. Now looking at Michael's bears, he thought he would win the prize. There was nothing as good as his entry. He imagined himself walking up for the prize and everybody looking at him in amazement and astonishment. There they would all be interested and want to see his horse, and then perhaps they would like him better. There was more discussion about the girls' entries. Annette was a skilled knitter. Grandmother had taught her when she didn't go to school. She had sat on her small stool, keeping an eye on Danny and clicking away at her needles, with Grandmother sitting in her armchair ready to help her whenever she needed it. Annette was entering a dark blue sweater she had knitted for Danny to wear on Sundays and festival days, with alpine flowers knitted in bright colors around the neck and the waist. She had not finished it yet, but it was coming along nicely, and everybody praised it as she sat working away in the playground. "I think you are sure to get the prize, Annette," said several of her friends. "It is harder to do a pattern like that than to make lace like Marcel," said everyone, and everyone says. Annette was hopeful, too. She wanted so badly to win that prize. It would make up for a little of getting such bad marks in math, and how pleased and proud Grandmother and Papa and Danny would be. However, unlike Lucien, she had very little time, for her after-school hours were always busy, and now the haymaking holidays had begun, and all the children working in the fields from dawn to dusk, side by side with the adults. A great deal of friendly arranging had to be done at haymaking time. A neighbor who had grown-up sons to help on his farms went up to the high pastures to look after the Bernet cows, while Monsieur Bernet came down to cut the hay on his own slopes. After he had finished, he always went over and cut the hay in the little meadow that belonged to the Morels, because Madame Morel was a widow, and Lucien was not yet old enough to swing a sickle. There were no tractors or mowers on those steep mountain slopes, only great sweeping sickles that mowed the grass in curved bundles all up and down the fields. Behind the men with the sickles came the women and the children with wooden rakes, pulling the bundles into tidy heaps. Even the tiny children had tiny rakes, for as soon as a child could walk steadily on his feet, he had to help with the haymaking. Papa and Annette had to work hard, for they had a large sloping pasture and could not afford to pay anyone to help them. They got up at sunrise each morning in the cool, clear dawn to start their work. Later on in the day, Grandmother and Danny joined them. Grandmother working slowly and painfully, and Danny doing no work at all because he couldn't manage a rake and a crutch at the same time. Instead, he jumped like a kangaroo among the bundles of cut hay and buried himself under the large piles, and when he was tired out, he lay flat on his back in the sun and fell asleep. Monsieur Bernet cut his own meadows first and then went off to cut the Morels' field, leaving his family together in his own bundles of hay. Madame Morel had rather worried this year that Monsieur Bernet would not want to help her because of Lucien's causing Danny's accident, but she need not have to worry, For she woke one morning, and from her window she saw him hard at work, his brown body stripped to the waist, swinging the sickle. He was not the sort of man to take revenge. "Hurry, Lucien," she called. "Monsieur Benet is already mowing the meadow. Run out and start raking in the hay." Lucien scuffled off to the field, feeling rather embarrassed. He had said good morning to Monsieur Benet with his eyes fixed on the ground. He hated having to work with the man he had wronged and kept as far away as possible. Monsieur Benet had no wish to talk to him either. It was one thing to mow a neighbor's meadow, but quite another to chat with the boy who had injured his little boy. Annette arrived at midday with her father's lunch wrapped up in a cloth. She took no notice of Lucien, and when he saw her coming, he slunk away into the house. It took Monsieur Benet 3 days to mow the Morels' meadow, and the third day was the last day of the holidays. Lucien and his mother and his sister were working hard to clear the fields before Lucien went back to school. They were all in the meadow when Annette appeared, as usual with her father's dinner. She was in a hurry, for the next day the children had to turn in their entries for the handwork competition, and Annette still had to put the finishing touches to her sweater. "I do wonder if I shall get the prize," said Annette to herself. "I want it so much. But even if I don't, Danny will look sweet in the sweater." The meadow lay at the back of the house, and on her way home Annette passed by the front. It was a very hot day, and Annette was thirsty. The door leading from the little balcony into the kitchen stood invitingly open. "I will go in and have a drink from the tap," thought Annette, climbing the balcony steps, and indeed there was no harm in that. Before the accident, Annette had run in and out of the Morels' kitchen as though it was her own. When she reached the top of the steps, she suddenly stopped dead and stood quite still, staring and staring. There, on a little table set against the outer side of the balcony, with some carving tools and chips of wood on it, amidst the chip was a figure of a little horse at full gallop, with a waving mane and delicate hoofs. Annette stood for 5 whole minutes gazing at the little creature. Of course, she realized it was Lucien's entry for the handwork competition, and the deceitful boy had never told anybody that he was entering, or that he knew how to carve at all. It was almost perfect. Even Annette's jealous eyes could see that. If he turned it in, he would win the prize easily. No one else's entry would be nearly as good. And when he won the prize, everyone would begin to admire his work, and perhaps they would begin to like him for it. Perhaps they would even begin to forget that he had injured Danny. If Lucien won the prize, he would be happy. He would walk up to receive it with his head in the air, and to see Lucien looking happy would be more than Annette could bear. Why should he be happy? He deserves never to be happy again. He would not be happy if she could help it, and she felt she had arrived just at the right time. The table stood on the level with the balcony railings, and a gust of wind fluttered the shavings of the wood. A stronger gust of wind could easily blow the light little model over, and no one would ever suspect anything else when they found the little horse smashed and trampled in the mud below. Annette put out her hand and pushed it over. It fell into the stones with a little crack, and Annette bounded down the steps and stomped on it. Anyone could easily tread on something that had blown over the balcony railing. So Lucien's horse lay in splinters among the cobblestones, and Annette walked slowly home. But somehow the brightness had gone out of the day, and the world no longer looked quite as beautiful as before. It was not long before she came inside of her own chalet, and as she turned the corner, she saw Danny. Danny saw her, and he gave a loud welcome shout. Something very, very exciting had happened, and if he had been able to, he would have raced to meet her. But being on crutches, he hobbled up the hill as fast as he possibly could. "Net," shouted Danny, his eyes shining. "I think there have been some fairies in the woodpile. I made a little horse down by the logs, and I found a tiny little elephant with a long trunk, and then I looked around and I found a camel with a hump and a rabbit with long ears and cows and goats and tigers and a giraffe with ever such a long neck. Oh, Net, come, look at them. They're so beautiful. No one but fairies could have put them down beside the woodpile, could they?" "I don't know," answered Annette. Her voice sounded quite cross. Danny looked up at her in astonishment. she didn't seem at all pleased about his news, and it was almost the most wonderful thing that had happened to him since he had found claws in his slipper on Christmas morning. However, when she saw them, she was sure to be pleased. She didn't yet know how beautiful they were. He hopped bravely along, rather out of breath because Annette was walking faster than she usually did when he was behind her. He dragged her to the woodpile and dived behind, reappearing with a procession of carved animals arranged on a flat log. He looked anxiously at her, but to his greatest disappointment, there was no sign of surprise or pleasure in her face. "I expect some other children dropped them, Danny," she said crossly, "and anyhow, it's nothing to make such a fuss about. They're not at all that wonderful, and then you're too big to believe in fairies." She turned away and went up the steps, hating herself. She had been unkind to Danny and spoiled all his happiness. How could she have spoken to him like that? What had happened to her? But deep down inside, she knew quite well what had happened to her. She had done a mean, deceitful thing, and her heart was heavy and dark at the thought of it. All the light and joy seemed to have gone out of life, and now she could never get rid of it or undo it. She ran upstairs to her bedroom. Flinging herself on the bed, she burst into tears. Tomorrow is Chapter 13, The Old Man's Story.